Down for Kids Church if you haven't already. Frank, go ahead and get down there. Don't want you to miss anything. He's leading it. All right. Frank always gives me a bad time, but I can be up front and do it in front of everybody. So, I don't know everybody's income, situation, circumstances, things like that. Oh, thanks, Bob. Could probably kick the grape juice over, yeah. Well, you probably want me to trip, just not spill the grape juice, right? Yeah. It's kind of funny when your friend trips and falls as long as they don't get hurt too much. But anyway, so income situations, circumstances, I don't really know that about most of us. But I'm guessing that most of us, if not all of us, are not like extremely wealthy, like by American standards. Just, some maybe have a little more than that. But when you think about by American standards, like, oh, people probably here aren't like super, super wealthy. But if we look at a bigger picture, if we compare ourselves to the majority of the people in the world, we actually do have a lot, which you might know. And if you just consider everyone who's living now or has lived in the past, and again, like worldwide, global, thinking about this, we are actually pretty rich, right? We really do kind of have a lot. And it's from a few years ago, but it's probably still pretty accurate. If you make $60,000 in a year, you're in the upper 0.2% of everyone in the world. Okay, 50,000's upper 0.3%, 40,000 upper 0.6%, and if you get down to just 20,000 a year, which in America is really getting down there, maybe like towards poverty level type thing, you're still in the upper 4% worldwide. Which means if you're really good at math like me, that means that you earn more than 96% of the world, right? Did you see the crazy math I did there? Yeah, so now if you get down to even like 10,000 a year, like not even 1,000 a month, like really you just really can't even get by in America really with that, still would put you in the upper 16% more than 84. Am I doing the math again, right? 84 or otherwise. But another way you might look at this is just to think about four questions. One is, do you own more than one pair of shoes? 2, do you own a car, truck, or motorcycle? 3, do you have a choice of food each day? And 4, do you have more than one change of undergarments? And if you answered yes to 3 of those 4 questions, you are in fact rich compared to most people in the world, because only 1 in 10 worldwide can actually say yes to even 3 of those questions. And as we'll see in our passage today from James, in the first verse, he writes to rich people, and I think that it's not exactly us in the way we might normally think of it, but I think there are principles that maybe relate to those of us who are fortunate enough to live in America, right? We have stabilizing health care. We have protection of the military, protection of the police. We have, free education. Most of us, if not all of us, can actually answer yes to at least 3 of those questions that I mentioned. I think probably all of us own more than one pair of shoes, right? I mean, yeah, we do, I think. And we have a choice of food each day. And maybe it's something we're excited about, but probably none of us has just one thing in our pantry or just one thing in our refrigerator. And I think we probably all have more than one change of undergarments, right? So, and I'm actually guessing that most of us who drive either own a vehicle, or at least we could in the right price range, right? If you want the brand new expensive one, you might have a payment, but in the right price range, like most of us could own a vehicle. So this morning we're continuing in our series called Real Faith in the Real World, and it's taking us through this letter from James. And today's message is called A Bad Investment. It's Not All Yours. And we're going to look at the first 6 verses of chapter 5 in a moment here. And it should be pointed out that God does not condemn people simply for being rich or having a lot. Some of the godliest people in the Bible were wealthy. You had Job and Abraham and Joseph, David, Solomon, Barnabas, Philemon, Lydia. I mean, there's several people in the Bible that had a lot, but they were called godly as well. But Jesus does you might know, he does warn about the difficulty of the rich being saved, like it's hard to kind of serve two masters and that whole thing. And what we see in our main passage for today are actually some pretty strong words for people who have a lot, and you'll see especially maybe in the way that wealth is acquired and the way it's used in those things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's look at the passage together, and then we'll go on from there. But Christian, you can throw up that first slide of James 5, yeah. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages, and we can do the next slide. The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. So specifically what we see of the rich people here, it's not referring to every rich person or everyone who has a lot of wealth and resources. It's really talking about people who have a lot who are unjust. And they're abusing the power that they have. They're treating other people terribly. So it's not just what they have. It's kind of how did you get it? How are you using it? How are you treating other people? It's a bigger picture. If you have the notes on the back of your bulletin, the fill-in-the-blank notes, we're going to start with the first one there. And if you're watching online or maybe listening later this week, it's not even there on the website yet, but it will be, the audio, maybe the video too. But if you're on our email list, I know I say this a lot, but just a reminder, if you're on our church email list on Thursday, Evelyn sends out a few announcements and reminders, and also has those notes, and you can even follow along if you're watching online or listening and so forth. So merely being rich in and of itself is not a sin, but our first fill-in-the-blank note, riches can become a problem depending on the manner in which wealth is acquired, the spirit that wealth can potentially produce in the heart, and the way in which wealth is used. The idea in verse 2 in that phrase, your wealth has rotted, is the idea that these people had accumulated way more than they needed for their own use, and instead of giving of any resources to do anything good for someone else, or really even to do anything useful with those resources, they kept them until they rotted or spoiled, and then they were of no use to anybody. So in that culture in the Middle East, a considerable part of the treasures that people would store or lay up consisted of things that were perishable. Things like garments that the moths could get, or grain, or oil, and that kind of thing. So we think about, when you set aside some provisions for the future, saving some money, setting something aside for the future, potential emergencies and that, like that's a good thing to do. Like, it's foolish not to have anything for the future, right? We all understand that. But the reference in this passage from James is talking more about the idea of like storing up these huge quantities, perhaps while the poor were suffering all around them, and then just hanging on to all that stuff until it became worthless. That's more the picture we're seeing there, not just kind of saving some and being smart, having a little preparation for the future. In verse 3, where a rich person's corroded gold and silver testify against him, we see the idea of money not being used, or wealth resources not being used as it should be, whether that's paying somebody it's owed to or just in doing good for other people with it. And I think these verses, and it's the context, right? So we're starting into chapter 5 this week, which means, try to follow me on this, like last week we were at the end of chapter 4. Yeah, just trying to do a little funny thing. That was for Neil mostly. So, but the context of this, right? It makes sense that this would tie in well with the end of chapter 4. And you might remember, if you were here last week or watched online or listened, we talked about that verse, the end of chapter 4, that said, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. That's the context here, right? So we talked about how we often think of sin as doing the wrong thing or a bad thing, which it is, right? But also how sin is knowing the right thing or a good thing and not doing it. And that, again, context. And we mentioned also how our most important purpose, beyond ensuring the salvation of ourselves and others, is to do good for people whenever possible. Of our own free will, we just have that heart. We want to help people. We want to do good. Nobody's making us. We just have that heart. We want to follow Jesus. We want to serve other people. We want to help other people. Now, back in our passage today from James 5, what we see in the 4th verse talks about the wages that a rich person failed to pay his workers. That kind of applies pretty strongly, I think, to like a system of slavery, where the slave works to produce so much more than he receives, just so the master can keep pretty much all the profits for himself. I think this verse and I think this passage as a whole makes it pretty clear that this whole type of system is condemned by God. And you see these are harsh words we read in this chapter, right? That this whole system is condemned by God, and it's contrary to the very spirit of genuine Christianity. These are strong warnings, right, that are given to the rich who oppress others. You know, we see things like miseries that cause them to weep and wail, and riches that are corrupted, and clothing that's moth-eaten, gold and silver that's corroded. And when that corrosion of their riches occurs, it says it will serve as a witness against them. Meaning that, and it's our next fill in the blank on your notes, they were guilty of the things to be mentioned shortly, like hoarding wealth, failing to pay the wages owed to their workers, and living in luxury and self-indulgence. And I think these things apply to us in the modern world right now too. As far as I know, I don't think most of us here like own a business and directly pay people's wages. But are there principles from this passage that still apply to each one of us? The intense warnings against these types of behaviors make me think that we should at least examine ourselves and maybe see how the principles potentially apply to us. I mentioned earlier that we're rich compared to most people in the world, and with that being the case, we probably have benefited a great deal from the poor. Even if we haven't intended that or even realized it, it probably has had a cause and effect as far as the really kind of high standard of living that we have compared to most people in the world. Chad, I'm going to just blame things on Chad because he was telling me about this message he heard from the preacher Brian Jones, and you might recognize that name. We've kind of gone through a couple of his books and used some ideas for some messages here and things, but he listened to this sermon that just happened to be talking about James chapter 5, and we're just in James chapter 5 because we're going through James, and here we are. This is the passage that we're on, and this message of Brian's is called Loving Your Neighbors by Your Lifestyle. And Brian talks about how followers of Jesus, we like to have sermons and messages and Bible studies and series on the book of James. I've heard many of us even talking about it lately. Like James is just, it's such a good book of the Bible. It's so practical. It really applies to our lives each day. And I think that's true. But also how we don't really, you don't hear as much about chapter 5. Especially these first six verses of chapter 5. Like, we don't necessarily want to go through. And then if I was just picking something to preach on, I wouldn't say, hey, I really want to hit those first 6 verses of James chapter. Like, it's not the thing we naturally want to talk about, right? It's kind of uncomfortable. It's kind of difficult to think about some of this. But when you do go through a series, it's a neat thing is you kind of naturally just come to all the verses and passages, including the difficult ones that might be more nice to just avoid. If you're going through a series, you just can't really get away with that. So, in Brian's message, he talks about this book called The Secret Lives of Groceries. And the author, Benjamin Lohr, he's investigating and reporting on the human lives that are at the heart of the American grocery store. And some of these things that I'll kind of share for the next couple minutes were pretty convicting to Chad and his wife. And as I listened to Brian, the same was true for me. And maybe that will be true for you out there. Some of you, I don't know whether that's the case or not. And you know, certain things kind of convict us more than others. But whatever it is, whether it's this or something, I want to encourage each one of us to just find some practical way to love your neighbor in a tangible way, to do something good for other people, to help in any way that you can. Whether it's along these lines or not, because this is like what I'm going to kind of share seems like something I don't really have any good idea how to make it better. It just is something that just kind of bugs me now that Chad decided to bug me. So over this past year, we've all these things we've had to deal with, we all are well aware of, right? And we think of like doctors and nurses caring for the sick, which is critical, right? But also the men and women who stock our shelves and operate our warehouses and things like that, they're kind of understood now as essential workers too, right? And they provide a quality of life that we can kind of easily take for granted. And one of the questions that this book's author proposes or poses is, who suffers for our increasing demands for convenience and efficiency and lower costs? And this is a little bit mind-boggling to me when I think about most people in the world kind of working all day to have a little bit of food, to maybe have one good meal, and they're spending hours and don't have any money and all that. And, yesterday I got up and had some coffee, and I went for a fairly long run. I did about 6.5 miles. And I came home and I helped clean the house and, vacuumed and washed toilets, all that stuff. And so by the time I did, I'm just saying all that because by the time I did all that, I hadn't really eaten anything except for like a bagel at 7 a.m. So by the time we went out to do a couple errands, it's like 2, 3 in the afternoon. And I'm extremely hungry because of all that, because I hadn't eaten much and I had done a lot of physically active things. And so I just jumped in the drive-through, and within just a couple minutes, I had some food and a Coke. And it just kind of boggles my mind a little bit to think how quick and easy and cheap it is for me to just get some food when I'm hungry. And a couple bucks for a burger or whatever is, for most of us is not very much, right? And it's just that perspective thing, and it does kind of hit me in that sense. Now, the book is talking about this. It said that the cost of food in 1900, like maybe what our great-grandparents would have spent, was 40% of their income went to food. 40%. So maybe an average person makes around $1,000 a week, give or take, or a family does whatever. I don't know what everybody makes, but think about if you did make $1,000 a week and $400 a week went out just for food. Like, that's a pretty significant percentage, right? By 1950, our grandparents were spending about 30%, which is still just kind of mind-boggling, right? But now today, more modern times, we average around 10%. So, and then in the early 1900s, the first grocery stores started opening up, started operating their businesses. They wanted to deliver the freshest and healthiest groceries possible. And in the big picture of just human history, like, grocery stores are an incredibly recent phenomena, right? Like in the early 1900s, they started coming about. So in America, I'll give you a fill-in-the-blank note for this. We spend less money on food than almost every other country in the world, and we spend less time gathering that food than at any other time in history. That's kind of what I'm saying when I could just jump in a drive-thru in a couple minutes. I've got a food and drink there, just like almost instantaneous and at a cost that was almost nothing to me, right? And then somehow each year these numbers I mentioned have gotten lower and lower, and less percentage spent on food and less time to get it, while the quality and the quantity and the variety and safety and all that have gotten better and better. And the question is just to think about is, well, how did that happen? How did we get to that point? How does the price of food keep getting driven down while it gets fresher and fresher and fresher? So obviously technology has improved, okay? It's easier to plant and gather and transport food and all that. It just is. It's a lot. You can do that a lot easier and quicker now. So that's definitely been a driving force in this. And there's things, the big agro companies introducing the genetically modified organisms into our food. Like, you go up to Green Bluff this summer and maybe pick some strawberries right from the fields fresh, and then you go to the grocery store and buy a thing of strawberries too, right? And then you get home, maybe put both strawberries containers in your fridge and just let them sit side by side. Now, the ones you picked fresh If you don't eat those, then within like 3 days they're done, right? Those ones that were fresh picked. Or the ones you got from the store, maybe, maybe like after 7 days-ish, they'll kind of get moldy and stuff. So you're talking at least 2 times the shelf life as the freshly picked ones. So we see that in our foods and things too. But having said all that, we should also recognize that one of the big reasons that the food we eat is incredibly cheap is because a lot of the small farmers who make the food and provide it, transport and all that, earn a very, very small wage or profit. The migrant farmers who go and pick those crops make just a pittance for their wages. The small like rural transport drivers, they'll go and pick up produce, and a lot of them can't even afford to buy and eat the very food they're transporting because their wages are so low. Think about a bag of grapes. Okay, if you're hungry already, I'm sorry to mention anything food-wise, but think about like a bag of grapes and look into the food system and consider if everyone in that system was paid adequately and they were, given some sort of safety net and structure in their compensation, that bag of grapes would probably cost us like $25. If everyone along that whole process kind of got a fair wage and maybe some kind of benefits, all those things. And I said already earlier, I don't know kind of how to solve this, but it just kind of is convicting to me to think about how I guess easy I have it relatively, and how quickly and cheaply I can get food, and why is that the case? And next time I go to the store, that's probably just going to be on top of my mind. As I was putting this message together, I get a lot of groceries at Fred Meyer. And so I thought, okay, $25 for a bag of grapes. I'm just going to look on their website and see what they're asking for grapes right now. And so I looked up a 2-pound bag of red seedless grapes was $3.98. Okay, so it's just, I don't know like what you can do about, like I if I had to spend $25 on grapes, or that projection of 6-8 times the regular price for all these things, like I don't know how I would afford to eat, right? Like it's kind of the way the system is now and relative to our income and all that. But all of that, it just makes me want to help people who are less fortunate than me, that don't have it as easy. And if there's anything that can be done to maybe make the whole system better, I'd love to help in some way with that too. And so, the people that are growing, picking, transporting, often arranging in our stores the very food that we're eating, the ones who make it possible for us to have so much food at such a relatively low price, are often people, not often, they are people about whom we should ask the question, do we love them as we love ourselves? Because there's something just wrong about a system where people who are giving us food cannot themselves often afford the very food they're giving us. So just to fill in the blank, for this to kind of keep the overall concept in our mind. Next slide. Do we love our neighbors as ourselves? And are we willing to do something practical about it? And that's kind of the bigger picture of all this, whether, like I say, maybe the food thing gets your mind going like mine or Chad's or something, but maybe it's something else, like just something that is that there's a need. Someone needs help, and there's something you can do about it. Are we willing to do something practical to help somebody else who needs it? Is there anything you could do in your lifestyle to make you more aware of people who don't really have anything? And you can even think of, if you want to think of the food thing, you could think about, what if you ate just one plant-based meal a week, if nothing else for awareness, because we kind of have this luxury in America of eating meat. The vast majority of people in the world don't eat meat, or they eat very little because it's just too expensive. Or sometimes you think of just even growing a garden just as a way of reminding ourselves of people that are hurting around us. And again, I know that's just the food thing, but how can we think of people who have a lot less than we do? How can we be reminding ourselves of people that don't have the kind of luxuries that we have, in whatever way that is? And most importantly, what can we do as followers of Jesus to be known as the ones who want to love our neighbors with our lifestyles, the ones who care? How can we be known as the ones who want to help, the ones who want to make a difference? we think back again, this main passage for today from James, what are some practical applications we can draw? And that's really getting into the specifics of the types of behaviors that were being pointed out in those verses. But your next fill in the blank on your notes, we need to be careful how we obtain our wealth. If we do it at the expense of others, we will bring God's wrath upon us. Success should not come by stepping on and mistreating others. And it also might be worth pointing out what we read in 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse 9. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money, okay, not just money, but the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So it's not like riches, wealth, belongings, material possessions. It's not those things in themselves that are wrong or bad. They're kind of neutral. But that desire to have more and more and more and be rich and wealthy, and that desire, riches should not be the goal of our endeavors, but sometimes they might be like a byproduct of them. So someone might want to be a doctor because they want to help sick people. They want to improve the health and lives of people. And because society places a high value on that type of service, a doctor might be pretty wealthy, but to enter a profession solely to get rich can easily cause someone to be trapped by the love of money. And people find out, too, if that's a motivation that you think it makes you happy, you kind of find out it doesn't really make you happy either. How should we obtain wealth, riches, belongings, and so forth? If we do it honestly and ethically and as compensation for a job well done, then God's not displeased with that. But if we do it by hurting others, by making wealth our primary object, having that just extreme desire for that, then I think we have to say God's not pleased. Like, again, those verses we read in James are pretty strong. And we also need to be careful how we use our wealth. What James describes in our passage is essentially spending our money on luxurious living when there's people all around us who are suffering. And it actually indicates, when we do that, it indicates a lack of love for God himself too. Look at 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. According to the New Testament, the purpose of working, in a lot of the verses that we see, is not to just obtain wealth for our own gratification, but a big reason is to help those who are less fortunate. Ephesians 4:28. Anyone who's been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. 1 Timothy 6, starting at verse 17, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, we can get the next slide, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So maybe we can ask ourselves, are we laying up treasure in heaven or on earth? And your last fill in the blank on your notes, those who lay up treasure in heaven are those who use their wealth to do good for others and to help the poor and less fortunate. And just one more verse here from Matthew 19. Jesus answered, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. And I kind of mentioned earlier, but this isn't meant to be the type of thing like everyone should be like forced to do this. Like, we We don't need like a government system saying, hey, we're going to take everything from you, give it something. Like it's supposed to be a free will, free choice. Like, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I have a heart for people around me. I want to serve. I want to help. I want to meet any needs I can, rather than just storing up way more than I'll ever need, is more that idea there. Because what's valuable for eternity is treating people right, it's showing love, it's offering grace and forgiveness. And when it comes to wealth and material things, as one person said it, we're meant to use possessions and love people, not love possessions and use people. Did I say that right? Okay, I almost felt like I said it wrong. Then you guys would walk out saying I had everything backwards today, which you might say anyway, but don't want to intentionally do that. Part of my, not part of my title. It is part of the title today of our message is "It's Not All Yours," and I'm actually not sure that's even quite right, because really it's not that it's just not all ours. It's actually that it's all God's, right? And He just entrusts it to us. And that word we think of there is steward, that we're in charge, we're managing, like God's blessing, providing, and what do we do with what He's blessed with us? That's why we give back to God in tithes and offerings, because we're trusting Him and we understand that it's all from Him. It's not just that it's not all mine, it's actually that it's all God's, and what do I do with it? How do I use it? So when you come to the end of your life, what will your money and your resources say about you? I know I need to do better at this. Because as we talked about early on today, we have a lot. Okay, we might not be extremely wealthy by American standards, but we are pretty rich by world standards. And as I talked about early on this morning, like, it's really likely that every one of us here owns more than one pair of shoes and has a choice of food each day and has more than one change of undergarments, and probably even own a vehicle of some kind, or at least you could in the right price range. Those are 4 things that are true for most of us, if not all of us. And as I said before, only 1 person out of 10 in the world can say that even 3 of those things are true for them. So all that to say is, just knowing that we have a lot, we should remember that it can become a problem depending on the manner in which our money and belongings are acquired, and the spirit that wealth can potentially produce in our hearts, and the way in which our resources are used. Okay, as we get ready to close for this morning, it's good, it's wise to be prepared for the future. It's foolish not to. Okay, but if we store up huge amounts, like way more than we need, while others are suffering, and we do nothing to help them, or at least we don't put our resources to some good use, we're not loving our neighbors. We're not living how God wants us to live as His people. So just as we get ready to go out in the world this week, can you think of one practical thing you can do to love your neighbor, to do good, and to help someone in some way? If you follow Jesus, will you do something to be known as a person who loves the people who Jesus loves so much? Will you live in a way that people know you care, that people know you want to help, and people know you want to make a difference?
Thank you, Troy. We're going to have